I hope you all have a chance to see Bill Poland today and that you're able to go to church in person. But for those who aren't, I don't want you to miss out. And so I'm bringing to you today a word from Luke chapter 2. Remember, we left Jesus and his family. Well, actually, they were returning to Nazareth, but here we are back in Jerusalem at the temple. They have come for Passover. It was always the desire of Jewish families to be able to make it to Jerusalem at Passover. In fact, during Passover, still as a part of the Haggadah, most people include, sorry, the Haggadah is the script of what happens on Passover as the Jews celebrate Passover. And each family has their own Haggadah, their own pattern of Passover worship that they use. And as people celebrate Passover as a family, at the end, very often there's this line where they say next year in Jerusalem. And that's because Passover is ideally celebrated in Jerusalem in the holy city. And so that is what people aspire to as Passover is celebrated. So this is from a time when Jesus and his family were at Jerusalem for the Passover. Since so many Jews want to be there, the city swelled with population during Passover, and it was packed, just packed. And it would have been really hard to keep track of everybody. Jesus at this time is about 12 years old, the text says. So I was going to say a tween, maybe you would say. Not quite a teenager, but not a kid anymore. And this is during this time, a 12-year-old is almost accountable. So adulthood happened a lot earlier in the biblical times. A little bit later for men than for women. Women were considered adults when they were very young at this time. A lot of them would get married at 13 or 14 years old. Um, at this time, Jesus is in the temple at 12. He's almost an adult. And this is what happened. Mary and Joseph had completed everything and returned to their hometown in Nazareth, and the child grew up and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and God's favor was upon him. Each year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home. But the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. Supposing that he was among their band of travelers, they journeyed on for a full day, while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who heard him was amazed by his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." Jesus replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he said to them. Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother cherished every word in her heart. Jesus matured in wisdom and years and in favor with God and with people. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What a joy to see that that Jesus is starting to understand as a child the calling that is within him. if we are to imagine, I like this text because I think way too often we see Jesus as God and we forget that he's also fully human. We acknowledge that homoousios, the sort of complete existence of God and human in one being, of one being with God. That's the phrase that entered into our vocabulary when we adopted the language of the creeds. Back in the day, um, boy, I want to say it was about 385, there was a council in Chalcedon. And this council was was one of those big debates among the church patriarchs of the day. They got together and they argued because that's what theologians do best. And they argued about whether or not Jesus was God or Jesus was a person. Because there were different sects of Christianity, and these sects believed different things. And at some point, the church said, we need to figure some of this out. So they set their best scholars on it and they debated it and they read scripture and they just struggled and struggled and struggled with this. And at the Council of Chalcedon, we came up with something called the Chalcedonian Creed. And it was an affirmation of the fact that Christ was fully human and fully divine. We can see it in Scripture. It actually is pretty easy to see in Scripture. Once they came up with it and everybody read it, they looked at it and they looked at Scripture and went, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." Uh, but we struggle with it because it's hard to imagine how both natures can fully exist inside of one person. How can we be fully human and fully divine? Because we can't. We have already missed that boat many, many times, right? We embrace full humanity, but our divinity is a little bit short of perfect. And yet, we affirm the full deity and the full humanity of Christ. But it's hard to do both at the same time. And so in this scripture passage, what we have is the embodiment of that Chalcedonian Creed. Jesus is figuring it out. And he looks like a pretty ordinary kid in this text, doesn't he? He has become so occupied with his call in the temple that he is neglecting his parents. Now, I am convinced that Jesus would have known that one of the Ten Commandments is honor your father and mother. And I think if Jesus had thought about it pretty deeply, he would have known that not telling them where he was at and kind of wandering off wasn't honoring them very well. Now, I'm not saying that this is not following the commandment because Jesus here is saying, of course, my father needs honored as well. That is my parent. Not just you guys, but God is father and needs to be honored. But he's really not being super kind to his parents, is he? Those of us who are parents who have lost children before know how it feels to lose a kid and how responsible we are for that and how freaked out we get when we can't find them. Um, we have this family tradition of accidentally leaving kids places. When I was little, we left my brother at Kmart. I know I've told you that story before. When Andrew was little, we left him at Fairway. Now, Andrew got out of the car to go to the bathroom inside, which, you know what, is not against the law to go to the bathroom. He just didn't quite tell us where he was going. So, so we thought he was in the car and drove off. And Andrew was not in the car. We left him. And a couple miles south of town, I realized there's not two kids in the car, there's just one. And my heart stopped in my chest, and I pulled over and I turned around and drove back to Fairway as quickly as possible, as quickly as the law allowed. And on the way back, I get a call from someone at Fairway who was like, "You left your child here." It was awful. I felt terrible. And yet I was also very, very much like Mary in this text, angry. Why would you do this? You knew better. They thought he was about 4 because he was very small for his age. And at the time, he was 7 and headed toward 8. So he wasn't super little, but he was old enough to know that he should have told us where he was going when he left. But still, he was young enough for me to have heart failure that suddenly he wasn't there. Honor your father and your mother, and don't do that to them. Don't cause them to have a heart attack because they don't know where you're at. But also honor your father and be in the temple. How can you do both at the same time? Well, when you're fully divine and fully human, that's how life works. We forget that Jesus had this struggle within him his whole life of knowing and understanding his call, but also knowing and understanding where he was, his very physical nature. And so we don't always acknowledge and understand that humanness of Christ. Or sometimes we don't always acknowledge and understand that divinity of Christ. So this is one of those passages that pulls us into the struggle of being fully human and fully divine. Jesus isn't being naughty in this text, but he also isn't perfectly behaved in this text. Jesus is perfectly Christ in this reading. I imagine that those theologians who argued the nature of Christ so long ago probably loved this text because herein lies the true nature of God, fully with us and fully God, all at the same time. And both matter. This week, on this strange January time of year where sometimes we feel like we're in a lull theologically in the church. Things slow down a touch. And we think, oh, Christmas, Epiphany, done with that. Now we can just kind of ride along until we get to Lent. This is one of the most challenging passages in our whole Bible. I hope that you enjoy, pray about it, and consider what it would be like for Christ to be all God and all us, all at the same time. And if you have a chance this week, I challenge you to Google the Chalcedon Creed. That's Chalcedon. Chalcedonian Creed is how you see it when it's in front of Creed. Chalcedon is the name of the town it was developed in. And give it a read, and remember that that is a part of our faith too. May you be in love with even the difficult parts of our scripture. And maybe we shouldn't quite sit on our laurels this January, but we need to think real hard about some things. So I hope you do look those things up. I hope you have an amazing January. I am at this moment today, I am, look at the date, somewhere in the ocean, in the Mediterranean Sea. Um, I think I am in Marseille, probably in France. So, um, from the port of Marseille, I give you my love, and I tell you that Christ is so amazing. I hope you think about that this week. And you are amazing too. And I love you and miss you, and I will see you soon. Bless.